Welcome. I'm Carl Frederick, and I will be interviewing individuals for Kenosha Voices, an oral history project of the Kenosha County Historical Society in conjunction with Kenosha Community Media. I have worked in newspapers for more than 40 years as an editor and a reporter. 38 and a half of those years were at the Kenosha News. I am also a member of the Kenosha County Historical Society Board. We hope you enjoy these programs. Hello, I'm talking with Rita Petretti, co-owner of Petretti Properties in Kenosha. Thank you for being here.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
How did you get started in the property business?
Well, it is a family business, and you get started almost from birth when you're involved in one of those. So I personally became concretely active in the business about 50 years ago, in 1973, when I joined the company full-time as we were starting to build apartments. But I had started when I was a teenager, actually, working under my mother's and dad's tutelage, doing some bookkeeping, physically warehousing things in our home office. It was a very just learning from the bottom up sort of operation.
Do you have any siblings involved as well in the business?
Yes, I have two sisters. One of them, Patricia, is full-time. She's been with the business since about the early 90s. And my other sister, Paulette, is a lawyer, and she works part-time with us. So all three of us are completely involved in the business, along with two nephews, Trisha's sons, Frank and David.
Okay. You mentioned warehousing. Did the business have a warehouse somewhere?
No, I mentioned that because our business was run from the home for probably about 20 years until Mother and Dad built the Villa Capri Shopping Center, which is when they had their first office outside the home. So the basement was the office and a warehouse for parts and equipment, etc. And as young girls, we had a job. We had to inventory, sort all the deliveries of things like doorknobs, hinges, etc. So we were early on very much involved in the business. And unfortunately, our bedroom was above where the office space was in the basement. And if we didn't get up early enough in the morning, Dad would be down there and he'd have a broom and he'd hit the ceiling and say, "You don't get up, you no catch no fish," which is a real Italian proverb. So anyway, we learned the work ethic very early.
Okay. How did the business get started?
My father was a skilled carpenter who came from Italy in the late 30s. He went to trade school outside of Lucca. Well, actually in Lucca. His home was just outside of Lucca in the province of Tuscany, not far from Florence in Italy. And he came here to search for a better life in the late 30s.
How old was he at the time?
He was about 24 at the time. And of course, we were still in the Depression years, and things were not so easy, but he did get a job working for Camozzi Construction. And in that capacity, worked at places like Great Lakes when they were doing work there, a church out near Lake Geneva. He also did little side jobs for other Italians in the community who heard that he was a good craftsman, so they'd have him do cabinets, little repair work, remodeling. And then he said, "I want to go on my own." And an Italian family, I believe the name was Gallo, asked him to build a house for them. And he did that. I think that was 1947. And that really was the start. That house is at 3717 22nd Avenue, and it stands very well still to this day, in very good condition.
He was a carpenter and decided to build a house. How big of a leap was that?
You know, that's a very good question, because I don't know if this is apocryphal or really true, but supposedly it was a two-story house, and supposedly he had never done anything with stairs. So he had to figure out how to build these stairs, which he did, which is, you know, something that people learned in different ways, I think, years ago. And you just figure out how to do it. And the house is in very good condition, so obviously it worked.
So how did he go about designing this first house?
I'm pretty sure that house may have had a design that the family wanted. Maybe they'd gotten it from an architect, or they said build it like this. And he would always add little touches, though, to even architecturally designed places.
So he started with one house in 1947. And the last house was built when?
Well, the last house would have been in the 80s, I think in about 83, 84. He had a handful of lots. He always bought large acreage, and then he had it subdivided. And his last big parcel was called Villa Capri Alta, in the area of 15th Avenue and Birch Road. And he had that subdivided for homes. But that was about the time when the market changed, and people were not able to buy homes. Interest rates were inching up. So a city planner at the time, Bob, I can't remember the last name, unfortunately, suggested to Dad that he build some apartments because they were sadly lacking in Kenosha at the time. So he took some of that property along the railroad tracks, and that was converted with city approval to multifamily housing. And there were a few single-family lots still in that area, and after using most of it up for apartments, he had these single families. So he said, I'm going to clean these up and build these houses. And this, as I say, was in the 80s.
So in between the first and the last house, how many houses did he build?
Probably close to 1,000.
And were they all on the north side?
No, he built a number of houses in the late 40s and 50s. His reputation grew, and people would ask him to build houses at scattered sites all over Kenosha. But there was a particular area in Allendale on 3rd and 2nd Avenue south of 75th Street, which, if I'm not mistaken, had been a golf course at one time. And some individuals in the community had subdivided that. So people were starting to buy those lots, and they were looking for good builders. And he also bought some of the lots and built some houses on spec there. And they were what you'd call the mid-century design. Ranches with cantilevered posts in the front, a little bit of Frank Lloyd Wrightian. Some of his customers had their own plans, some he designed himself. But this was probably in the very early 50s.
So when he went completely out on his own, where he didn't have plans from somebody else, and he decided to build on subdivided lots.
Right.
Who came up with the models? I mean, how many types of models were designed, and who did the design?
This is where my mother was involved in the business early on. And in fact, she would do the running back and forth to the job sites because, as I say, the office was in the house. And she did all of the paperwork, you know, that type of thing. And they together, after he bought this large acreage on the north side of Kenosha in what became known as the Villa Capri neighborhood, they would design these houses together. Very simple but efficient, 1,200, 1,300, some 1,400, some 2 bedrooms, mostly 3 bedrooms, very solid houses. And they would make little variations on the themes, so to speak. And they built hundreds of them. This was in the era of, there was something called Levittown, which started in the East Coast in that era after the Second World War, when there was a great demand for new housing for people, young families. And he kind of was following along in that path.
Okay. Did your mother bring anything unique to the plans that they made in these homes?
Yeah, feeling for what works. I think women understand that. And she also did a lot of especially on the spec houses, she picked out a lot of the colors, the materials, the interior finishes, those kinds of things. And then at a certain point, they had to, they incorporated, and my mother had to become a real estate broker because they couldn't sell these houses independently anymore. So she went off and in the late 50s got her real estate broker's license.
And then she could sell?
And then, they sold basically, but she had the paperwork behind it. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So your father is developing these subdivisions and came up with these various plans, and people liked them and came to purchase them. Mm-hmm. Was there a time when there was a big move in his time of building houses that really became a big year? Or
it was through the late 50s into the 60s. Part of that time I was still at home, and he was never home because early in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning, he'd be gone. 8, 9 o'clock at night, he'd come home. And when the office was still in the home, this was another funny story. He would come home with a piece of scrap lumber, and he would have written on it all of the material he needed for the next day. And he'd get on the phone with Gordon Lumber Company, his supplier, and he'd say, okay, this is what I need tomorrow. And that was it. But he never wasted anything, including scrap lumber.
You must not have seen him very much.
We didn't. No, we didn't. And on Sundays, when there was sometimes a day of rest, we'd often take drives and drive around to potential building sites or see what other people were doing, that type of thing.
Did he get any ideas from other builders?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you know of anything special?
Nothing in particular, but he always liked to see what the competition was doing. Mm-hmm. And there were some other active builders at the time. There was a gentleman named Joe Shaffron who built a lot of homes on the south side of Kenosha. Again, these affordable first starter type homes.
Okay, so where did he get his employees?
He was all union.
All union.
And he subcontracted, of course, the mechanicals, the roofing, the excavating, all of that. And I would swear all of them were union companies. And that was a very strong movement at the time in Kenosha. He himself was a member of the union, a lifetime member, and stood behind that very strongly. Mm-hmm. And of course, the carpenters he had were the ones close to him, and he only wanted the best. Very, very demanding. So it was. Some people said it was hard to work for him, but because of that.
Okay, so they would frame up the house, and then somebody else would come in and put plaster, or would they do that as well?
Yeah, we would have a contractor like, one of the contractors in plaster was Irv Schultz, and Don Bain, that's another name that comes to me, who was a plasterer. And his homes at that time were all plaster. Even though drywall had come in, he was still using plaster.
Okay. He had a good relationship with his vendors?
Oh yes, they liked working for him, but like I say, he was very demanding, and he wanted only quality work. And that is why he was successful, because he had a reputation for quality, which carried him through into other things he did. He wouldn't settle for less. The floors were oak. There was good trim. The cabinets were handcrafted. There's no question that was a major factor in his success.
What would you ascribe to his success?
Very hardworking, very ambitious, very determined, very intelligent, and almost more than anything, a personality.
Now, how did that personality work for him? What was that personality?
Well, he made people feel good. But if they didn't do the right thing, of course, he didn't make them feel so good. But it was over. They got the point, and then no hard feelings after that. When we had our senior buildings, and he would go around the buildings, he was very charming with the older ladies, and he would say, "You look nice today," and all those things. And he was, I think this is also more important, humble. There was nothing fancy about him. You never got the sense, even when he became successful, that he felt he was better than you. He would be working always on the job sites in workman's clothes. Bankers would come around to check on their investments, and they'd see people work, and they'd come up to him and say, "We're looking for Frank Petretti." And he'd say, "Oh, I don't know where he is." Then he'd fess up, of course.
And you said he came to Kenosha. What made him pick Kenosha?
He had relatives here. The Bianchi family was, the wife was his cousin, and they ran the Lincoln Food Market in the south part of Kenosha, and they were here already, so he thought that this would be a good place for him to give a start.
So where did he live when he first came?
They were living, and he lived with them, I think, right across the street from what is now Holy Rosary School on 22nd Avenue, about the 4000s. And then that's where, when he married my mother, whom he met at the Italian American Club, at a party for Italians from northern Italy, because her father had come also from northern Italy. And they met there, and then rented an apartment from the Bianchis in that house. And that was the start.
And what was the approval process like when you wanted to go and say, "I'm going to subdivide and I'm going to build homes"? What?
As I recall, it was quite much simpler than it is today. And I remember my mother going down to City Hall with sketches, nicely done sketches of the floor plans of these houses, and go to the planning office. And they'd usually say, "Okay, this is good." Sometimes there were meetings with City Council, particularly with subdivision development, but for the permits for the houses, that was a little bit simpler. She became a regular down at City Hall, and then we would have to go before City Council to get approval for subdivisions and everything that goes with
And
that.
what kind of a relationship did your father and mother have with the aldermen?
Oh, Dad had a fabulous relationship with the alderman. When there were he wouldn't ever go to the meetings. Sometimes he'd send somebody else, or he'd just wait for them to call him after the meeting and say, "Okay, Frank, it passed." And sometimes they'd even come over to the house and have a beer with him to tell him the good news.
Okay. So was he ever in the service?
Actually, he was. Not only was he in the Italian Army, but he was drafted into the U.S. Army in 1942. In fact, I just came across his papers to report to Fort Sheridan on December 10th, 1942, along with a list of all kinds of other fellows from Kenosha. And they sent him as part of the Army Corps of Engineers to Kansas. He had problems with his eyes, so he was never sent abroad, but he did serve in the Army for a couple of years, I think.
Okay. In the process of all these homes and all these apartments. Now, the apartments you said started in the mid-'70s.
Yes, or early 70s.
Yep. And then I also understand that he built a considerable amount of senior housing.
He did. He started with the conventional market rate apartments, primarily 2 bedrooms on 15th Avenue. But then there was a program called Section 8 that HUD had developed for seniors.
The Department of
Housing and Urban Development, right. And it was administered in Wisconsin through an agency in Madison. Locally, people knew about this program and felt that Kenosha needed it. And Dad got wind of this and decided that he wanted to have a go at this. And he did get the approval for his first building, which was called Villanova, on 18th Street at 24th Avenue. And 18th Street didn't even go through at the time. It was lots of open space up there. And one of the reasons he got it is because the people in Kenosha the politicians in Kenosha gave him A+ ratings for the quality of his building. And of course they wanted that out of Madison. So there was a lot of learning curve about dealing with the government on a higher level than certainly Kenosha. And you can imagine the bureaucracy that one has to deal with when you're dealing with an agency like HUD. But we got through it, and then got another approval for a second building for seniors. And then a couple of years later, a third project, which was called family housing for people with children, et cetera. Mm-hmm.
And then when all was said and done, how many apartment units were built?
Well, under that program, there were about 300 under the various HUD programs. But on our conventional properties, all told, probably close to 1,000.
Okay, and what is your job today?
Well, it's a little bit of everything. It's leasing, it's managing the financial side of things. It's purchasing, it's maintenance, it's the issues that arise when you're dealing with people and buildings that are getting older. I've heard it said that buildings are like people. The older they get, the more they have to go to the doctor, no matter how good their genes, how well they're taken care of. You still have a little more doctoring to do.
And who does the maintenance?
Well, we have a crew, and then we contract a great deal of it. Sometimes it's easier to have contractors deal with the nuts and bolts of personnel, et cetera, and equipment and so forth, like grass cutting, for example. We've had contractors on that for a long time. When we do have to hire employees, one of our greatest sources has been retirees, particularly from the trades that have worked on our buildings. And they retire early, many of them, but they don't really want to give it up completely. So they are very useful in maintenance work for us.
Okay, and so you visit the properties on occasion, or?
Oh yeah, well, Dad was known to make the rounds of the properties all the time. He had pickups all the time, then he started driving little vans, and people would see him driving around with his little cigar. He always smoked cigars. I think he chewed on them more than he actually smoked them. But he was very vigilant about all that. So you need to keep that up, and I do that. I am very much around to make sure nothing is awry.
Okay, are you chummy with the alderman like your dad was?
Well, we don't need it now like we did, and there was a time when I was involved in lots of that approval process for our properties, but not since we've not been building so much. I personally, during probably the 80s and 90s, was involved in the development of Kenosha through activity in the Chamber of Commerce and the Kenosha Area Business Alliance, because we all felt in our family that what's good for Kenosha is good for us. So we were actively interested in seeing that Kenosha grew.
So did your father have any special relationship or do anything to reward aldermen? Or was it that much of a, not a controlling thing, but just a keep tabs on them, or what?
Well, back in those days, let's say the 60s and the 70s, I don't think there was anything wrong with rewarding the aldermen for their good service. So I vividly remember at Thanksgiving time, the aldermen getting turkeys. Dad would send my mother out to Hawkeye Turkey Farm, and they all got their turkeys.
Okay. Have you had to learn a lot, or what kind of things did you have to learn in order to do the job that you do today?
When Dad was around, I didn't have to do too much with the capital repairs, etc. But after he wasn't involved anymore, I had to learn a lot about asphalt, boilers, things that are not necessarily my bailiwick, but you learn as you go along, just as he did when he was starting his business. Some things you learn better by experience or through experience and osmosis than you do reading a book.
Were there any technological advances or world events or economic situations that affected the business?
Oh, in the period of the 70s, the late 60s, early 70s, when the economy went bad, all kinds of things were going on. Interest rates went so high, things slowed down a lot for building. And that is when this land that had been slated for single-family construction was converted to the multifamilies. But finances were always a challenge. Whatever money was made was always plowed into new construction. And there were many, many tough times. It was definitely not a smooth path all along. They had taxes to pay on all the land that they had. And if it wasn't earning anything, where's the money going to come to pay the taxes? But they were able to make good on everything they ever owed. There was a treasurer of Kenosha County, I think her name was Ruth Raditz. And I remember her working with them on payment plans to get those taxes done. And I think they were so thrilled when they managed to get that off their backs, so to speak, because they didn't want to ever be in debt. And they paid their bills, let's put it that way.
Any technology changes that occurred during the time? I mean, the tools must have changed a little bit.
Well, yeah, the tools greatly, but well, cell phones. That was a huge thing because even when I started in the business, part of what I did was run back and forth from the office, which by then we had built an office on Birch Road in the early 70s, right near our apartments. So there was a lot of running back and forth with phone messages and orders and information and so forth from the office. And that's why our jobs were always close to the office, actually, so that made it convenient. But then when cell phones came along, the big bricks is what we had to start, I think in the 80s maybe. That helped a lot. So that's one bit of technology. Mm-hmm.
So what do you feel the best part of your job is?
Oh, well, when I was involved with construction, getting something, having a finished product, building something that's going to last. There's a lot of satisfaction in that, even though I'm not doing the building, but I'm part of it. And I love that. I love the construction, and I think that comes from myself and my sisters being involved with this business right in our home for many, many years. And I also enjoy the people that we deal with. Being a landlord is, many people consider not an easy thing, but it's it's rewarding when you know you have given people good homes and that they're happy and they're comfortable and they feel safe. And that's the important thing. I would say that's one of the best rewards of what we do right now.
Do you have much turnover at the apartments that you manage?
Probably by industry standards, a little bit less than what might be normal, because we do rent to a lot of retirees. We are renting to people whose parents and grandparents had homes that were built by our company. And that's very satisfying as well. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for talking to me today.
Well, it was a pleasure. I enjoyed the series and look forward to seeing more of what you're doing.
Thank you.
Great project. Thank you. Bye.